Right, what have I been obsessing about this week? I've been reading an article about cunning folk, the difference between them and witches. And when I say cunning folk, I don't mean the Tories or the Labour Party. The cunning folk I'm talking about are also known as folk healers or wise folk, and it's a general term for practitioners of folk magic, folk medicine and divination, which has been practiced throughout the ages. Now, during the early medieval period, various forms of folk magic could be found amongst the Anglo-Saxons, and they referred to such practitioners as Wicca or Wiccae, male or female practitioners. But in the later medieval times, the times of the witch hunts and the witch finders, anybody openly claiming to practice magic was in essence painting a target on the back and inviting themselves to be burned at the stake. Witches were hated because of the idea that they were cursing and hexing innocent people, according to the church, that is. However, in many areas across Britain, distinctions were made between witches and cunning folk. It seems that the common population revered and respected cunning folk for their aptitude for healing, protective charms, and their talent with other useful or popular magic. And their services also included impeding witchcraft cast by dark practitioners. You could say there were two sides of the same coin. One set themselves up as honest people serving the communities, and the other supposedly hid in the shadows and wrought death and suffering with devil worship. These cunning folk must certainly have led curious lives, because on one hand they've seen people burnt at the stake and brutally whipped for practicing magic, while they made a living and were respected and appreciated for doing almost the same thing as those being punished. Must have been weird. But the common people of the population generally made a distinction between the two. Much of this changed with the Witchcraft Act of 1541, and it was enacted under the reign of Henry VIII, and it targeted both witches and cunning folk, and it stipulated that the death penalty for such crimes as using invocations and conjurations, or to locate treasure, or to cast love spells. And right across the country, many people were accused of witchcraft by members of their local communities or even family and put on trial. But for the cunning folk, it was much, much rarer that they suffered a similar fate. In fact, it seems very unusual for a cunning man or woman to actually be accused of witchcraft. So it shows these people seem to have the trust of the community. The question I find myself asking is whether the magic of these cunning folk did or did not work. But nobody can be sure unless you were there. But what we can say is that people kept coming back. They kept coming back to these seasons, seemed to be professionals who built up a successful business and local or even national reputations. Now this includes people like Mother Shipton and George Pickingill. These were people with national reputations. So it seems these individuals must have been delivering something that the people wanted in some form or another. So did these cunning folk have the wisdom to realise that their patrons were not really seeking the return of a lost key or the name of a thief or the love of someone who doesn't like them, but instead they wanted a sense of control over otherwise uncontrollable features of their lives? I guess in a similar way that religion promises the bounty of a mysterious God who didn't always deliver. So this so-called magic of the Cunning Folk offered to make sense of the world, and possibly not as a rival to religion, but with a more pragmatic approach to the spiritual world. As I was researching, I also found a very unusual aspect of the Cunning Folk practitioners. Women have been taught over generations that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach, but medieval women appear to have taken this advice to the extreme. They were said to be using supernatural cuisine to seduce their husbands, and a 12th century monk once warned against women who had taken to stripping off in the kitchen and kneading the family bread with their buttocks. And there was reports of much cruder baking techniques reported, which I won't mention here. Now, a woman today with an array of aids and advice at hand this may seem like a lot of work, but in an era when arranged marriages were the norm and husbands had license to beat their wives at will, fostering intimacy through magic might have felt essential to a woman's safety, showing the importance of the Cunning Folk again. But many of them seem to be of herbal folklore healers, whose knowledge was probably passed down through generations. But as most of these such healers were illiterate, as were most of the population, they seem to come up with rhymes and songs to remember their concoctions, which may have inspired the witches' spells found in literature and myth. Spells, rhymes and songs. It's a good way to remember. Women were usually more common in the roles of Cunning Folk. Their responsibilities of caring for the health of the family, often as they got older, extended to the community. But some historians have proposed that the witch hunts represented a concerted effort to drive women out of healthcare. But then others say it was a time of professionalisation of the medical field, which only men seem to be allowed to take part in. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below.